All right. Hello, everyone. Let's see. I'm gonna try putting background music and OBS updated, so I want to see how the levels sound between my voice and stuff. All right, I think I'll turn my voice down just a little. I think. Okay, that'll probably be fine. All right, welcome to the stream, everyone. Um, I think I'm gonna try to do more like casual weekend streams of just like fun stuff in between videos. Not only does it like help the channel, not only does it kind of give me a chance to connect with the audience and stuff, but it's just fun. Stuff like this is fun. And I thought I would do an Empire tier list. To be clear, I did not make this tier list. I changed the ratings a little, but like all of these options, there's like 80 options here. I didn't pick these. These were the ones that were there, so I'm sure there are going to be some empires that are missing. But 80 empires is a lot. So I think this will do. So basically, what I wanted to do to make this tier list a little different is I am personally basing this tier list on whether I find them interesting to learn about. And that's the key thing here, because I think a lot of people, when they do like a tier list like this, their first thought is like, oh, the really powerful empires go at the top, the weak empires go at the bottom, and stuff like that, or maybe like, oh, this one had the most impact on history, this one had the least impact on history, and things like that. I'm not gonna go down that route. This is purely on whether I just find it interesting. I am basically treating empires in the same way that I would treat genres of music or flavors of ice cream or something. It's literally just going to be as simple as like, do I actually enjoy learning about it or reading about it, or do I find them boring? Do I find them overrated? So for the tiers, S tier, super interesting all around. It basically means that like I just love learning everything about whatever the empire is. A, always fun, it's great. B, neat. B just means like, yeah, that was kind of neat to learn about. I don't necessarily get excited learning about it, but it's still a good time. C, average interest. I don't particularly like or hate learning about it. It could be interesting, it could be boring, but it's just kind of somewhere in the middle. D, I'm using for overrated. That just means that I think like, oh, this empire, a lot of people seem to find it interesting, I just don't. I think it's a little overrated. It's not horrible, but I don't think it's as good as everyone else thinks it is. For E, I put super boring. I am actively bored when trying to learn about it. And then F means that I'm not just bored, I am hating learning about it. And then I've got an extra category for I don't know this empire enough to have a fair opinion. So we will see how this tier list goes. So like I said, since this is based on my opinion, there could be some very powerful and popular empires that could be on the lower tiers, and some random empires that could be really high up. It just all depends. Let's see. All right. So let us begin. I'm going to try to go in order. The Abbasids. The Abbasids were the caliphate, the second one. Originally, when Muhammad was leading during the rise of Islam, it was part of the Rashidun Caliphate. That was kind of like the first iteration. Oh wait, no, I'm sorry. The Abbasids are the third. It was the Rashidun, then it was the Umayyad, and then it was the Abbasids, however it's pronounced. But basically, the Abbasid dynasty was set into place, and so it's kind of like basically medieval Islamic world before the Mongols and before the Turks. Um, Abbasids are I haven't read like a ton about them, but what I have read about them is that they're pretty neat. Um, I I've listened to a few podcasts and read a few things about like how they would administer their empire, because their empire was huge. Having like almost the entire Middle East, all of North Africa, and Spain. That's a very wide spanning empire. And unlike something like Rome, where like Rome had like a network of these roads that were built over centuries, like the Abbasids basically like had to deal with sometimes scattered and more isolated areas of their empire, um, which is ultimately why it eventually fell apart. But kind of like what little I have read about like how they were able to maintain their empire for as long as they could. It's just kind of interesting. I as I've gotten older, I've kind of learned to enjoy learning about, oh, how did things work. And so yeah, I think they definitely go in the neat category. The Achaemenid Empire, S tier, easy. Everything about the original Persian Empire is just fascinating. Administration, military, culture, all of it. I am always excited to learn more about the Achaemenid Empire. So many neat events, and just in like all fields. And you know I I can't even think of like anything about the Achaemenid Empire I have ever disliked learning about, or at least knowing about. They've never bored me. Just fascinating empire all around, easily. The Ajuran Sultanate, I honestly have no idea about anything about them. So, yeah. Axum. Axum, I am going to put in the neat category. So, Axum was basically like medieval Ethiopia, early medieval Ethiopia. Um, they're pretty interesting. The fact that they, because Ethiopia was one of the original areas to become a Christian nation, and Axum in particular not only um, represented that, which kind of made them unique for uh, the continent at the time. They helped stop the expansion of Islam from further south, which so they're very impactful. They also had a bit of an economic empire by kind of controlling the choke point around the Red Sea. And there was a point during their history where they basically invaded the Himyarites, which was in modern day Yemen, and they basically controlled Yemen for a while, which is kind of interesting. Um, Definitely could read more about them, but yeah, they've always been pretty neat, I would say. Um, Ashanti. Ashanti, I'm gonna put in average. Um, the Ashanti kind of have a what's it called? I forget the proper name for it, but like the stool. There's like in Ashanti culture, there is like basically like it's kind of like a stool that kind of like is like their equivalent of a throne. Um, and it's supposed to be like extra significant to how like court politics were run in Ashanti. And basically it was so important that if it was like stolen, it would like cause like conflicts and like things of that nature. And what little I've read about that, I found sort of interesting. But that is honestly like the only major thing about Ashanti history. That, and that they got conquered by the British. But those are basically the only things that I really know about them. But I'm gonna put them in average. Assyria. That's definitely a category. Assyria, Assyria has always been fascinating because even though the Sumerian Empire under or sorry, not the Sumerian Empire, the Akkadian Empire under Sargon, even though that is credited as like the first empire, Assyria kind of feels like the almost like the true first empire, because like the Akkadian Empire unified all of Mesopotamia, but like Assyria had Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, lots of Anatolia, parts of Persia. Not too deep into Persia, but they really kind of like pushed it in the box. And what's always really fun about the Assyrians is the way that they kind of changed warfare by basically bringing about the age of iron weapons and warfare, and that advantage was partially how they were able to conquer so effectively, and the other empires basically had to catch up. And in particular, I've always been fascinated by the downfall of Assyria, because the downfall of Assyria involved Egypt, the Medians, which were basically like they were like a Persian dynasty that controlled like northern Iran and parts of Anatolia, and Babylonian rebels. And all three of them working to take Assyria down. And because it's ancient times and things were much slow, this process of taking Assyria down took like 2 decades. And it, as weird as it sounds, it kind of almost reminds me of something like the Napoleonic Wars, sort of, or like a World War II, or just like that whole idea of like every other local ancient power at the time having to form an alliance to take Assyria down because they got too big for their britches. Like, I always found that like really cool and fascinating. It kind of gives me similar vibes. It's like, oh, what if like the Allies but ancient weapons in the Middle East? As weird as that sounds, and I've always found that super interesting, for sure. Austria-Hungary, I I'm actually kind of torn. Um, oh, they have Austria and Austria-Hungary separated. Okay. That's actually kind of interesting. Um, I am going to say Austrian Empire, which means between 1806 and 1867. I'm gonna put in overrated. Um, Mainly because keep in mind, Austria became an empire during the Napoleonic Wars, so this is not the entire history of Austria here, and they've separated Austria-Hungary, so that means this is basically, it starts with them getting their asses kicked by Napoleon multiple times, to winning the Napoleonic Wars because Prussia, Russia, and Britain were better than them. And they then got their butts kicked again by Sardinia and France and got driven out of Italy. And it was basically like just all these sort of things where their military just was not doing very well. They were not effective at administering, which is why they had to become Austria-Hungary as a compromise. They're just like I think that like the Austrian Empire is elevated because they've got the legacy of the rest of Austrian history, and so people just kind of think like, oh well, Austria was this great power of Europe, and yeah, like medieval Austria was, but it felt like by the time that they declared themselves an empire, they were almost like having like a weird midlife crisis of, oh look, see, we're calling ourselves an empire now, we're upgrading, but in reality they were a shell of their former selves by that point. I really think that. And I'm not as like familiar with early Austrian culture as I am with later Austrian culture, so I can't really factor that in here. So since this is separating Austria from Austria-Hungary, for those first 6 decades of the 1800s, it's pretty meh for me. I think it's overrated. I don't hate it. I don't even think it's necessarily boring, but I just think it's a little overrated. Austria-Hungary, though, I am actually going to put in neat. And the reason why I put Austria-Hungary in neat is because now Austria is basically on borrowed time, and they're one tick away from falling apart and crumbling, and they're trying to hold themselves together for 50 years, or ish. So let's say 1867 to World War I, so 1919. So yeah, basically approximately 50 years of there's no way this empire is going to work out, and they're trying to hold themselves together, but, you know, not only are they dealing with that, but they're also simultaneously like, oh, let's take Bosnia, let's try to carve up more of the Balkans. They're really pushing their luck, and there's something about like, so if the Austrian Empire is okay, Austria is past its zenith. Austria is like middle aged, but Austria-Hungary is like when they're old and everything is starting to crumble apart and everything is coming around them. That is infinitely more interesting than this. So I would for sure say that Austria is overrated, but Austria-Hungary is really fascinating just to learn about all of it falling apart, for sure. I hope that makes sense, because it's kind of a weird reason to like something, but it. But yeah, that's just kind of honestly how I think. All right, the Ayyubids. Ayyubids, I am going to put in always fun. So the Ayyubids were basically a dynasty of Islamic Egypt that arose during the Crusades era. So like Saladin, he was a part of the Ayyubids, and the Ayyubids started with basically like a slave uprising, and which is kind of funny because the Mamluks were also a slave uprising, I believe, too. They like both started with slave uprisings, overthrowing the previous dynasty, but basically it's Saladin's little empire, and which includes all of his military adventures against the Crusades and beating them back, which is always fascinating. Yeah, that was just always fun. All right. Aztecs. S tier. Everything that I have ever read about the Aztecs is just endless fun and super interesting. The fact that they are an alliance of 3 city-states that use bullying to basically run like a weird mafia-style empire across central Mexico, that is just endlessly fascinating. Because, like, for those who are not more familiar with the Aztecs, they weren't like a consolidated empire in the same way that Rome was. They were what was called the Triple Alliance, where it was Tenochtitlan and I always forget the other two, but it was Tenochtitlan and 2 other city-states that basically formed an alliance. And yes, like they had like an emperor or whatever, but it was basically an alliance of 3 city-states where they agreed to team up to bully other city-states around them, and they would, beat them in a war, but instead of saying, oh, you're now like the next province of our empire, It was more like, okay, um, you will now support us in future wars, and you will give us tax money. In exchange for that tax money, we'll protect you. It's kind of got that like mafia tactic of like, I see you don't have insurance. It'd be a shame if something bad were to happen to that business of yours. Where it, they're literally just bullying them into paying them for protection. It's such a really interesting way to learn about that, to learn like how the Aztecs run things in that way. And that's partially why they had so many enemies whenever the Spanish came in and they fell apart. Um, but that is just endlessly fascinating to learn about. Not to mention the aesthetic is just beautiful. Aztec aesthetic is just awesome. Um, the fact that they had Aztec warfare is always fun. The fact that they've got not only unique weapons, but they have soldiers who wore jaguar pelts. That's really cool. They had the flower wars, which not only were used to basically bully other city states into submission, but the whole flower wars to fight each other specifically for the purpose of ceremonial sacrifices. Just everything about the Aztecs is just so fascinating. So S tier, easy S tier for the Aztecs. Babylon. So Babylon, I'm gonna be real, and this may be a little controversial. Babylon, I'm gonna put in overrated. And keep in mind, as a reminder to the people who are watching, this is overrated in terms of me finding them interesting. They are obviously still very important to history, and I am not going to deny that. With like Hammurabi's Law Code, Nebuchadnezzar, and all that stuff. And I'm assuming that this Babylon is combining both the ancient Babylonian Empire and the Chaldean Babylonian Empire. Either way, I think it's overrated. Mainly because honestly, outside of Hammurabi's Law Code, I just don't find the original Babylonian Empire that interesting. Other than the Law Code, that's really it. They didn't have the same expansionist, game-changing flair that Assyria did. Their aesthetic to me is not as cool as like ancient Egypt. They're important, but they didn't do anything for me. And then there's the Chaldean Babylonian Empire, which is a little more interesting to me, where that was the second Babylonian Empire that basically arose after Assyria fell. And, there's a little bit more interest. There's the connection with Judeo-Christian lore with, they famously took Jewish captives to Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar and stuff like that. And boy, was that drilled into my head growing up. Whenever I would like go to church, we'd learn stories about that. So I also got bored of that story too, just because of how many times I was, forced to hear that story over and over again. But the second Babylonian Empire under like Nebuchadnezzar and stuff like that, while it's more interesting than the original ancient Babylon to me, it didn't really last very long. It didn't even last a full century. Now that I think about it, it formed, I want to say, like 620 BC, somewhere in there, 612 BC, and then it got conquered by the Persians in was it like 550 BC, I believe? So yeah, they didn't even last a full century, so it's almost like too short. So I'm just going to basically I'm just gonna put them in overrated. That's just my honest opinion. Belgian Empire. Belgian Empire, I am going to put in active dislike. And see, this is actually kind of interesting because, on the one hand, the like Belgium is famous for the Belgian Congo. There were the awful atrocities and I would argue genocides that happened in the Congo Free State, um, and you know that's definitely something they're notable for, and I have read a lot about that. But that is also partially why I put it into the active dislike tier, because that is just depressing. Like, you know, there is an interest into learning about horrible atrocities of history. It's very important, but God, is it depressing? It, like, I will always read stuff about it because I think it's important, but like I never get excited for it. I just know that like anything involving the Belgian Empire is just going to be very depressing. And yeah, so I just dislike learning about it. Um, and that's pretty much as far as it goes. And you could also even throw into the fact that not only were there the atrocities in the Congo, but their colonial policies would lead to the future Rwandan genocide. So they're responsible for like two of the worst atrocity events to happen in modern African history. It's like, yeah, it's just so depressing. And that's basically all the Belgian Empire had. Like I guess they participated in the Boxer Rebellion and they won like a few city blocks in Tientsin, but that's it. Like that's if that's all there is to learn about your empire, then that like no, I'm gonna dislike it. Brazil. Brazil, I am going to put in average interest. So, uh, I could definitely read more about the imperial era of Brazil, but what I have read, there are a few things I found interesting. I kind of like the origins of Imperial Brazil, where it kind of starts before Brazil, where Napoleon invades Portugal, the royal family is forced to flee to Brazil, and that kind of begins like this idea of, oh, Brazil can run itself without needing mainland Portugal. And it sort of led to uh, Pedro eventually being put in charge of Brazil while uh, once Brazil had independence. And so that kind of lead up to the Empire of Brazil is kind of interesting to read about. And then Pedro's reign is, from what I have read about it, is pretty intriguing. But you know, I would need to read more about it before I would say that like, oh yeah, I always loved learning about Brazil. And for some reason, I'm never like thinking like, oh, I have to read about the Brazilian Empire under Pedro now. It's just more, when it comes up, I find it interesting, but I'm not like seeking it out as much. And maybe I should, but you know, I put it in average. British Empire. Okay, why do they have the British Raj separate from the British Empire? Okay, that's weird. Because I know the British Raj was administered as its own unique thing. Gosh, I am going to put British Empire in average. So, when it comes to the British Empire, I think it kind of depends on when you want to count the start of the British Empire as. Because, like, the British sort of had an empire when they were, doing the early American colonialism, right? So there's that era of the British Empire under the Hanover dynasty. the Hanoverian dynasty, where where like they've colonized parts of America. There's their privateering and trying to control the seas, competing with the Dutch, and admittedly, that era of colonial history is something where I occasionally find some neat things, but a lot of it is just, it's not my cup of tea. 1600s and early 1700s history for like colonialism and stuff like that is not my favorite thing to learn about. But occasionally I'll find something interesting. And then for the Victorian era, the era where they're basically invading almost every country and conquering a quarter of the world and all this stuff, same thing. There are some colonial conflicts I find interesting to learn about. There are certain geopolitical things that the British Empire did during that time that's kind of interesting to learn about. I love the Napoleonic Wars, but the British Empire itself doesn't really do much for me outside of certain individual events. And especially when, like, for example, what was the British Empire's stance on this European war? They hate the continent and they want to stay off of it, but if someone on the continent gets too big, they'll want to knock them down a peg. That's basically them with everything. What did they do with their colonialism? Oh, well, they took the most land from this continent, they sapped it of its resources, and they used it to get rich. Oh, wow, how interesting. Like they did with everywhere else. It's like, I don't know. I'm never finding myself going, I'm definitely not like an Anglophile, and I'm definitely not, a lot of British Empire is just not my cup of tea. And I would even say that I find the decline of their empire, like the post-World War II Britain, infinitely more interesting, in the same way that I put Austria-Hungary in neat. Because seeing that fall apart, seeing the British be in denial about their empire ending, and seeing the home politics after World War II, that is fascinating. But some people would argue that's after the British Empire ended. Because, some people will say the British Empire ended with Hong Kong being given back to the Chinese. But some would also say that it basically ended when India left. So, I don't know. I put them in average. I still don't like that the British Raj is separate, but I'll just put that in average too. Indian history has always been one of my weak spots, and I need to learn more about it. I find the Sepoy Mutiny a little bit interesting. That was essential to the formation of the British Raj. But other than that, that's pretty much like all I really know about it. Actually, you know what? Just to be more fair, I think I'll put the British Raj and don't know enough. I definitely feel like I should read more about specifically the British Raj, because other than the Sepoy Mutiny, I don't really know that much about it. Okay. All right, moving on. Oh, and also, by the way, I do have super chats turned on, and if you do send any super chats, I will answer them all at the end of the stream. Anyway, moving on. Okay, so the Bulgarian Empire. There were multiple Bulgarian empires, but all of them are always fun. I'm not even gonna lie. I'm trying to think of like a way to describe this, but like the Bulgarians were always like causing. I'm trying to think of like a good way to phrase this. They were always causing trouble in the Balkans in a way that was always just interesting to learn about. whether it was against the Byzantines, whether it was against the Avars, whether it was against other Slavic groups in the area. Yeah, and I know that the original Bulgarians weren't Slavic, but I meant like, because they kind of migrated into the Balkans around the same time is what I'm saying, which is why I'm saying other Slavic groups. Because Bulgaria was not originally a Slavic empire. I don't need to get into that. Point is, Bulgaria has always been fun to learn about. The Byzantine campaigns against the Bulgarians under Basil is also fun to learn about. So yeah, I would definitely put them in the always fun category. Burmese empires, I don't know enough, honestly. Yeah, I know way too little about the Burmese empires. Byzantines. Oh, where do I put Byzantines? I'm a little torn here, because I do think that the Byzantines are a little overrated, but I don't want to put them here because I do still find them pretty interesting to learn about. I am going to put them in the neat category. So let me explain. The Byzantine Empire lasted a really long time. And so, like, lumping all of Byzantine history together, there are some really, really cool parts, and then there are some really boring parts. I love the campaigns of Belisarius and Justinian. Like, that is always fun to learn about. Their revival in the 11th century under leaders like Basil is kind of neat to learn about. But I'm the whole era of, like, after the Fourth Crusade, I'm not nearly as interested in. And, you know, the 1453 Battle of Constantinople is always fun to learn about, but more because of its significance rather than the Byzantines themselves. So much of the Byzantine history is just like, I don't know how to describe it. It's like they want to be Rome, but they're not. Obviously, I mean they are, but you know what I mean. Like they're it's almost like hey, yeah, we're still Roman, even though we're completely different at this point. We're trying to keep the legacy alive, and in some cases that's really interesting when it's Justinian trying to conquer Roman territory. It's interesting when it's like, hey, we got beaten back, but now we're trying again. Like, any time that the Byzantine Empire is on the upswing, it's really fascinating to learn about, because it's like, hey, we're trying to bring Rome back, and you know, it's fascinating to learn about them trying to do that. But a lot of the stuff like Byzantine administration or Byzantine culture, it doesn't really, or anything after 1204, it's just, it doesn't really do a ton for me. And so it's honestly this kind of mixed bag where I know a lot of people where they love the Byzantines. They love learning about it. Like, Byzantine historians are extremely passionate, which is why I would almost describe them as overrated. But I'm not putting them in the overrated category, because the parts of Byzantine history I do really enjoy. So I compromised and I put them in the neat category. Oh, wow. I just realized we're almost at 500 viewers. Normally my streams don't get this much, so hope everyone's having a good time. All right, next is Carthage. Carthage, always fun. Carthage is really interesting. because when you think about like the ancient Europe and Middle East area, um, people always talk about how like the Greeks, you know, like colonized everywhere. Like, oh yeah, the Greeks, you know, they settled in southern France, they settled in Italy, they settled in North Africa, they settled in the Black Sea, they settled on Anatolia, they settled everywhere, and you know all that stuff. And but the other major group that did that um, were the Phoenicians, and Carthage. As weird as it sounds, Carthage is almost like Phoenicia's America, where it started off as this distant across the water colony, group of colonies, I should say, that were Phoenician, that eventually got separated enough from the homeland where they kind of unified under Carthage and became its own little thing. So similar to like the British colonies in America. As weird as that sounds, even though their histories are very different, obviously, but um, I kind of find that aspect neat, where they started off as a part of this one entity and then they became their own thing, and the fact that they were Rome's rival in a way that no one else was. People like to talk about the rivalry between like Rome and Persia, but the rivalry between Rome and Persia was very borderlands. It was always like, oh no, our border territories at the furthest extent of the empire are in danger of being lost to the Persians. So they were rivals, but like Carthage's rivalry with Rome was a fundamental one. Carthage was like the one where comparatively they could have potentially have ended Rome. They were an existential threat to Rome in a way that Persia never was. And the Punic Wars are really interesting as well. Just all of that is really fascinating. The only reason I wouldn't put Carthage in S tier is mainly because I have not they're like the Carthaginian like government and culture and stuff like that is not as like, you know, wow to me in a way that like Rome is. But so they're not everything about Carthage is really amazing to learn about, but overall Carthage is always fun to learn about. So I think definitely A tier is perfect for them. Anyway, the Chola Empire, like I said, Indian history is my weak point, so I'm gonna put them there. Uh, hmm. Real quickly before I continue, I'm gonna grab a water because my throat's starting to get a little itchy. So pardon me for a second. All right, sorry about that. Went to get some water. My throat was getting a little dry. Turns out water is important. You should drink some water, kids. All right. Okay, continuing the Empire tier list. Um, let's see. Danish empires. Well, I'm wondering why it says empires. Like, are they counting like the North Sea Empire in here too? Because I guess that was technically Danish. I guess it would also count the Kalmar. um, Kind of boring, not gonna lie. Because, like, I don't think Danish empires is including Vikings here, especially because, like, there were multiple Viking empires. Like, it's not like the Vikings weren't a monolith, but specifically, if we're talking about, like, everything in Danish history from, like, the North Sea Empire onwards, like, it's. I don't hate it, but it's just kind of boring. The most interesting Danish stuff, I guess, was like whenever they were attacked by someone else. Like, oh, right, the British attacked the Danish Navy during the Napoleonic Wars because they were sort of a threat. Oh, yeah, that's kind of neat, I guess. Oh, Denmark won Norway and controlled Norway for a little bit. Well, not for a little bit, for a few centuries, but like somehow like the Kalmar Union never really appealed to me. Like, yeah, there was a time where the Danish king was king of every Scandinavian country, and for some reason I just don't find that as interesting as like the Swedes. To me, Sweden is way more interesting than Denmark in almost every single way. So I honestly kind of boring. Man, water is delicious. All right, the Durrani Empire. Average. I read about the Durrani Empire when I was making my video on Afghanistan, and what I read, I thought like, oh, it's kind of neat. I should probably learn more, but it didn't like call to me. It didn't make me suddenly go, oh, I need to learn everything about the history about this empire. But I wasn't bored, so I put them in average. See. What is the point of this being a stream if the chat is just 100% ignored? I'm not trying to ignore you. I just had, I don't know, just kind of neat to have to see other people's opinions while I'm doing this, I guess. And like I mentioned, I'm going to be doing things like super chat at the end of this. But you know, if I see someone in the chat says something that's like really compelling, I'll definitely say so. But yeah, this is just kind of a more casual, laid-back thing. Britain isn't low enough. Yeah, I know. There are a lot of people who are saying like I should put the British Empire in F, but it's like no, I can't say that. Like I hate learning about the British Empire. No. Anyway, Dutch Empire. I'm not even gonna lie. I find the Dutch boring too. I really do. I just find them boring. I don't know why. The whole oh, economic powerhouse thing, that doesn't really interest me at all. The whole the East India Company, like it just doesn't interest me. That's like that. I already mentioned that part of history is just not appealing to me at all. Like the idea of like, oh, we had a decades-long struggle against the Austrians for independence, or sorry, the Spanish for independence, the Habsburgs for independence. Like that should fascinate me, but it doesn't. And it's like, yeah, they unified Indonesia into a giant colony. I don't know why that doesn't interest me, but it doesn't. They had a few colonies in America, but not a lot. They had South Africa briefly, but they lost it. They got bullied and conquered a few times. Like I don't know why. Like honestly, the Dutch Empire just kind of bores me. Yeah. Okay, ancient Egypt. Obviously, it's S tier. who in their right mind would think that ancient Egypt is anything but S tier in terms of just how fascinating it is? Like, ancient Egypt is like up there with like dinosaurs, in the sense of like 99% of all human beings will have a phase where they are just randomly obsessed with ancient Egypt. It may be different parts. It may be like, oh, pyramids and mummies are neat. Or it may be, oh, I like ancient Egyptian fashion. Or it may be, oh, I saw that one TV show set in ancient Egypt and I liked it. Like, whatever it is, like, everyone has a point in their life where they find ancient Egypt interesting. And to be clear, I'm assuming, or their mythology. Yeah, someone in the chat brought up mythology. Yeah, ancient Egyptian mythology is extremely fascinating. And for the record, because someone said in the chat that ancient Egypt is like super broad, and I agree it is. But I am assuming that ancient Egypt, this is like everything before Rome, which is still a lot, but I'm not including like Roman Egypt or Byzantine Egypt or anything like that. But just everything before the Roman period, is what I'm assuming this is. But yeah, ancient Egypt, super interesting all around. Yeah, I can't. It's kind of one of those things where even if someone said it was overrated, it would still be S tier. It's like okay, I don't know. It's just, I can't think of any reason to not put ancient Egypt in S tier. I always love ancient Egypt. The Fatimids. Honestly, I'm gonna say I don't know enough about the Fatimids. When it comes to the Islamic world, there are a few dynasties that I have read a few things about, but there are a lot of like these like dynasties that only lasted like a century and a half in various parts of medieval Islamic history that I know very few things about, and Fatimids is one of them. I don't know as much about the Fatimids as much as the Ayyubids or the Mamelukes. Um, so, yeah, I honestly don't know enough about them. Okay, Francia, I'm guessing they mean the Franks, which I'm going to put in neat. Charlemagne's a badass, obviously. The Franks were a force to be reckoned with for sure, and there are many aspects about them I find them interesting. But they're just not as interesting as some of the other Germanic empires. I honestly don't think so. Yeah, it's just, but they're still above average. I guess I'm just not like constantly like going out of my way to think like, yeah, this thing talks about the Franks. That's super exciting. Like I don't think I've ever done that outside of like Charlemagne. Not really. But I mean, I do like what I read about them, so I'm gonna put them there. They're pretty neat, I would say. French colonial empire. French colonial empire. All right, this is gonna make the Anglophiles upset. I'm gonna put the French colonial empire in neat too, and I'll tell you why. There's something about the French colonial empire where, kind of like the British Empire, they had kind of different eras, and the French colonial empire. There's the American era, which I actually find more interesting than the British one because they had so much and they lost it. Like, granted, they didn't like control a ton of what they claimed in America, but hypothetically, if France would have kept control of like half of Canada and middle America with like the Louisiana territory and Quebec, like if they would have kept all that, imagine what that could have turned into if that would have stayed that way. Like the idea of like they had so much potential of this giant American empire and then they lost it in the 7 Years' War, I find that way more interesting. Um, Everything about like the Haitian Revolution involving the French colonial empire, yeah, that's really fascinating to read about. Then when it's like French colonial Africa, doesn't really do anything for me. The French in Vietnam is kind of interesting to read about, but really it's the French colonial empire in like American history that I find really neat. And if it was just like American French colonial empire, it would be an A. But because of the rest of the French colonial empire, I'm going to leave it in B. Georgian Empire, I don't know enough. All I know about the various Georgian empires were the periods where they were fought over between Byzantium and Persia. And that's not really fair enough for me to judge Georgian Empire and how I find it interesting, so I'm just going to put them there. German Empire, always fun. I like the whole process of German unification is one of those topics where I can never get enough of reading about. The way the German Empire was administrated was interesting. You have World War One. I can't quite put it in S tier because there are some aspects of the German Empire that I do find a little boring. But the beginning of the German Empire and the very end with the unification and World War One are just so interesting that makes it automatic A tier. Even if the stuff in the middle I find a little boring. Let's see. Yeah. Someone in the chat said that it's a stretch to call Georgia an empire. Like, yeah, I agree. Like, I know that there's multiple Georgian. There are like multiple Georgian dynasties and stuff like that. It is kind of weird to lump it all together. I think it's weirder to lump the Georgian dynasties together than it is the Egyptian dynasties together. But you know, Ghaznavids, gotta read more about it. The Gurk Turks, I think I see the umlaut and I think like, is it Gurk Turk? Like, because that's usually what the umlauts do in like Scandinavian languages, but it just occurs to me I have no idea. Gok Turks, Gurk Turks, these guys, neat. They're definitely in the neat category for sure. Sorry, I took a swig of water. What I find fascinating about the Gurk Turks is they're like the proto-Mongols. Not saying that they are Mongolian, because they're not. They're Turkic. But proto-Mongols in the sense of like they were the first Eurasian steppe empire of such a magnitude, in a way that I would almost say they're underrated in terms of how interesting they are. Because everyone talks about the Mongols, about how they unified the Silk Road and all that stuff, and they did. But the Gurk Turks, at a similar extent, kind of did that too, just at a smaller level and earlier on. And there are many aspects to their history that are really fascinating that I'm just surprised aren't talked about more in like history YouTuber stuff. Like, for example, how the Avars, the empire, like I guess the Avars aren't on this tier list, but the Avars, the group that came from the Eurasian steppes and caused havoc in Central Europe and the Balkans for a century and a half, they were driven into there from Central Asia by the Gurk Turks. They were basically like similar to how the Huns drove a lot of people west. The Gurk Turks drove the Avars west, and there was a point where, even though the Gurk Turks are more involved with Chinese history than European history, that they actually were flat out sending wait, I'm sorry. Am I confusing the Gurk Turks with the Khazars again? I might be. It wasn't the Avars. Shoot, what group am I thinking of? The Avars are two. Okay, I need to double check this now. It's gonna drive me nuts. I really hope I'm not mixing things up again. Gurk Turks. Okay, no. It was the Avars. Never mind. Okay, good. I was correct. I had this worry that I was mixing up the Gurk Turks with another Turkic empire. No. Okay, yeah, it was the Avars. But there was a point where, even though they're more involved with Chinese history, because like the Avars were driven west, they sent diplomats to the Byzantines basically saying, hey, these Avars are kind of like our business. If you capture any Avars, be sure to send them to us. You know, we want to extradite the Avars. Someone in the comments said identifying the Ron with the Avars is controversial. Yes, I agree. It is controversial. So for those who don't know, the Avars did come from the Eurasian steppes, but there is a common theory that another group called the Ron, it's like ROUAN, or it's like RUAN-RUAN. There's multiple spellings. That there is a theory that group, which is the group that the Gurk Turks overthrew, that supposedly they're linked with the Avars, that like they're one and the same, similar to the Hun and Xiongnu theory. I don't think that they're the same, but the Avars are still a group that were driven further west by the Gurk Turks. And there are at least some records of the Byzantines talking with the Gurk Turks about the Avars. So they are probably not the Ron, but nevertheless they are still a group that the Gurk Turks believed were their vassals, and they didn't want them leaving their orbit, so to speak. Either way, it is still interesting. Yeah, I think the Gurk Turks are very overlooked, and I would encourage everyone to learn more about it. Golden Horde, average. Honestly, like the Mongol Empire is super interesting. Once it breaks apart into the 4 successor states, 5 if you count the Ogadids, but they didn't last very long. I other than the Yuan dynasty in China, I don't find them nearly as much interesting. But because of their connection to the Mongols, that's what fuels what interest I do have for them. And the Golden Horde's main interest is the fact that, they controlled the northwestern part of the empire, so that included the parts of Russia that the Mongol Empire controlled. And so the interesting parts about the Golden Horde is their conflict with the rise of Muscovy. But other than that, they don't really do a ton for me. So I'm going to put them there. Kupta Empire, I mentioned it before. India's my weak point, so I got to put them there. Han Dynasty. Han Dynasty's pretty neat. Um, Han Dynasty is interesting in the fact that they succeeded the Qin Dynasty to become the second dynasty to control all of China. They were bigger than the Qin Dynasty, and this was kind of the first era where China was starting to exert its influence outside of China to a significant level, whether it was incursions into Vietnam, into Korea, into the steppes further out west. And in that sense, it's pretty neat to learn about. It doesn't. At the same time, it's not my favorite Chinese dynasty to learn about, but it is at a pivotal point enough to where it's just very neat all around to learn about. I enjoy reading about the Han Dynasty. Hittites, average. In some ways, the Hittites are overlooked compared to like the Babylonians and the Assyrians. At the same time, I kind of get why. The Hittites controlled a power base in Anatolia during ancient times. Probably the most famous thing about the Hittites was the Battle of Kadesh, where they fought a battle with the Egyptian New Kingdom under Ramses the Great, and the battle was basically a standstill, and so it has the record for the first peace treaty that we know of, the oldest preserved peace treaty that we have. And so that is really interesting. But that is honestly the only interesting thing I could say about the Hittites, at least for me personally. Maybe I need to read more about it, but I don't really like I can't even think of like what the Hittite aesthetic is. I don't have an image in my head when I think of Hittites in the same way that I do with Assyria, with Egypt, or even with Babylon. But, they were a sort of powerhouse in the Middle East, so nevertheless, it's almost like I know so little about them, and that's what makes them so interesting, even if they still don't, like, drive me crazy or anything, if that makes sense. All right. Holy Roman Empire. Let's see. Oh. This is gonna make so many people upset. I gotta put them in overrated. I'm sorry. Like, I know the joke is that they're neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but even that aside, there's something about the Holy Roman Empire where I just don't get the hype. I find political history really interesting, but the Holy Roman Empire is almost too much. Hearing this German duke that controlled two castles that are 500 miles apart is competing with favor with this count that controls 4 castles closer together on the other side of Germany for favor with the Holy Roman Emperor, and none of medieval politics does not really interest me in the same way that later and ancient political history does. It just doesn't. The Protestant Reformation is sort of neat outside of the Holy Roman Empire for me. I when I learn about the rise of Protestantism, the stuff that happens outside of Germany, I find infinitely more interesting than inside of Germany. The most interesting thing about the Holy Roman Empire was when it got destroyed by Napoleon. If I'm being really honest, the 30 Years' War, as much as I know that it's super impactful to European history, I honestly don't find it interesting. Except for the defenestration of Prague. The idea that the war was started by someone being defenestrated out of a window, that's neat. But that's not enough for me to think that the Holy Roman Empire just isn't overrated to learn about. It honestly isn't. It's a meme for its border gore. and it's a meme because Protestantism, but that's really it. I gotta say it. It's overrated. Doesn't do anything for me. The Huns. The Huns go an A. Boy, the Huns were around for a really short time, but in what I have, ever since I was a kid, I had always been obsessed with the learning about the Huns. The story of Attila is intriguing, in the same way that in the same way of like Alexander, in the sense of this guy comes along, and for 20 years, 20 to 30 years, he causes endless trouble, wins all these battles, everyone fears him, and he's just changing history. The Huns are changing history, and then, whew, like a candle being blown out, they're gone. And I find stuff like that really fascinating, about how the Huns had so much impact despite what little they did and during what little time. And I remember that there was, and I don't remember what it was called, but there was a dramatized historical movie about Attila the Hun that I enjoyed as a little kid, and I'm mad that I can't remember what it was called, but I enjoyed watching that whenever they played it on the History Channel. The part about how the Huns drove the other German groups west, and how they kind of were a part of one of the big dominoes in the domino reaction of the Germanic invasions, is interesting. The Battle of Catalonian Fields, where Rome had to team up with other Germanic groups just to defeat the Huns and their Germanic cronies, is like really neat. The fact that Attila was going to sack Rome, talked to a pope, and then he turned around, and we know almost nothing of the details, is extremely fascinating. Even something as simple as during that same campaign where they eventually turned around, there was recorded cases of the Huns dealing with malaria, which is not really something that you read about a lot in like ancient warfare. I mean, they'll talk about like the plague maybe, but like something about like reading about like the Huns dealing with malaria is like, oh, that was an unexpected, interesting detail. Oh, neat. I don't know, just everything about the Huns is just always fun to learn about easily. Inca. Ooh. I'm gonna put the Inca in A. The Inca Empire, like it is hard to understate how huge that empire was. Like when you think about like how big you really are when you're controlling the entire Andean mountain range, or at least like 90% of it, that is huge. The size of the Inca Empire compared to like the Roman Empire, I actually think it's a similar size. Let me double check. Inca Empire size. Okay, and then let me check the Roman Empire, because in my mind the Inca Empire is like very similar in size to Rome, if not bigger. Okay, let's see. 160, so 5 million square kilometers. Okay, Inca. Oh, 2 million. Okay, never mind. I take that back then. Forgive me. So I guess Rome is double the size of the Inca Empire. Never mind. Nevertheless, though, like, this is still huge. Like, Rome had a sea to expand, and they expanded outwards from coastlines. Inca had to slog through mountains. The Inca had 4 provinces on how to run their empire. The Inca have... Now, I will tell you one thing that they actually... Even though the Inca are apparently not as big as the Romans, like I thought they were in my head, they did build a ton of roads in a similar way that Rome did. In fact, the highway... I need to find a picture of... Okay, the Inca road system. So what's so fascinating is due to the unique shape of the Inca Empire, they were basically able to build like just two major highways across the empire. But I want you to think about this for a second here. So the Inca Empire built two roads going through the Andean Mountains from Chile to Colombia. Like, that is insane. That is just like the amount of engineering for that is absolutely insane. And the fact that these roads were so good that similar to Roman roads, that these roads were just in use long after the Inca Empire died. There are still some areas today where part of what they built is still there and used as normal walking paths today. Like, that talk about leaving a mark. I mean, and like, look at this. Like, here's an area where like they had like brick walls on the side of the roads, and there's carving through mountains and hills and stuff like that. Like, that is really amazing. What is also amazing about the Inca Empire is the Inca Empire's taxation system. Now hear me out here. Normally taxes are really boring, but so if you don't know, the Inca Empire actually had the system where they did not have traditional taxes in the sense of like, hey, pay us a part of your money. What they did was they had okay, this is going to sound really weird. The Inca Empire had monarchical feudal socialism. Like this is really weird, but like, so what would happen is the Inca Empire owned every property, and whenever you became an adult in the Inca Empire, you would apply for some land, and so they would redistribute the land to people whenever they would become an adult. And their deal with the Inca Empire is once they were given a property, is that they would pay taxes in two forms. They would have a feudalism style thing where it's like, hey, I am your lord, and so you work the land that I give you, and so you give us a portion of the crops you grow. So it had that style of like feudalism taxes, but it also had this style of system where it was like you paid taxes in the form of labor. So like if you weren't a farmer and you didn't give up your food, or if you were particularly affluent, you would pay your taxes by contributing to Inca works. And part of how the Incan roads got built was like, okay, your taxes this year will be to spend like a week on highway duty of like helping to build the road. And that was kind of how they did their taxes. It was like a weird mixture of like feudalism and socialism. It like obviously it's not fully either of those things because it's more complicated than that, but it's unique enough of a system comparatively that I find infinitely fascinating. And this is to top it all off that they didn't have a writing system, which blows my mind. They did have a system of communication called Quipu, which was like, it was like tying knots on rope, and you kind of read the knot patterns on the rope. So they obviously had a way to communicate besides speaking, but it's not a traditional writing system. And that is super fascinating because that is very unique compared to everywhere else in the world. Yeah, it's just so fascinating. Like, they also didn't last very long as an empire. Let me go back. Yeah, they lasted 134 years. So they conquered the Andean Mountains. they built these long highways and all this stuff, and they just did all of this in such a short amount of time. Um, yeah, yeah. See, yeah, Daryl E. Lalone in his work *The Inca as a Non-Market Economy* noted that scholars have described it as a feudal, slave, or socialist. It's like, it's one of these three. We can't decide. It's like it's just so unique that you can compare it to either one of those things, and it's like, yeah, that's kind of like 70% true, but it's not. It's just unique. It's just endlessly fascinating. Actually, you know what? S tier. I'm just gonna upgrade Inca to the S tier. I'm gonna say it. Yeah, I don't even know why I put them in A tier. Inca or S tier. Super, super fascinating. Yeah. Anyway, Italian Empire. Average. Similar to Germany, I find the rise of the Italian Empire interesting. The Risorgimento, as it's called, the resurgence, the unification of Italy. I find it hilarious that they lost against Ethiopia the first time. I find it interesting the whole politics around trying to be a colonial empire, but always being outcompeted and how they tried to compensate for that. That's kind of a little interesting, but they're just not nearly as interesting as some of the other colonial empires. So like I just put them in C, honestly. Japan. Always fun. I mean, really, like, Japan during World War II is endlessly fascinating to learn about, and the political dynamics between that. Medieval Japan, even though I need to read more about stuff like the Sengoku Jidai, the stuff that I do know about it is definitely interesting. Their invasions of Korea, which, hey, I just did a video on a few days ago. You should check that out. Their invasions of Korea were really interesting. The samurai period of like all these constant civil wars is really interesting. It's hard not to find Japan super interesting. I'm not as obsessed with them as some people are, but I can't really say I've ever been bored with Japanese history. I really can't. Khazars, average. I think the Khazars are a little underrated in that most people don't even know who they are. But at the same time, kind of like with the Hittites, I kind of get why. They do have a few notable things, like how they had a dynasty of kings that converted to Judaism, which was kind of unique, especially for the time period. They had an empire that controlled the area of like Ukraine, the Caucasus, and parts of like southwestern Russia, but like they were just kind of they controlled the area in between the fall of the Huns and before the Mongols, and that's really it. They're not really like super amazing and interesting. So yeah. The Khmer Empire, average. I think that Khmer architecture is gorgeous. Like Angkor Wat is a gorgeous building. I every once in a while I do kind of like to play like creative mode in Minecraft to just build stuff when I'm bored. It's like adult building blocks. What's not to love? And one of the first things I built back in like high school was I basically built like a life-size replica of the Angkor Wat. It took a long time, but when I finished, I was so happy with it. But yeah, Khmer architecture is gorgeous. And They are fascinating in that they're just a really important empire in Southeast Asia. I'm only putting them in average interest because I feel like I should know. I need to learn more about them, but I'm not as like drawn to it compared to other things. Someone in the chat says it's pronounced Kimai. Okay, I'll take your word for it. The pronunciation. Yeah, okay. I guess Khmer's wrong. I'm sorry, guys. Yeah. Korea. I also gotta put them in average. There are certain dynasties of Korean history that I know next to nothing about. The Joseon dynasty. I'm probably butchering that. Joseon. Joseon. Chosen. Because I know it's also called chosen by the Japanese, but so that's probably not what they call it. Joseon. Either way, that era of Korea I find really interesting. Of course, that's the final dynasty, though, even if it did last a long time. The Three Kingdoms era of Korea is interesting, but I don't think that they're counting that because I'm presuming that this is just talking about unified Korea. So, because this is the empire tier list, not the cultural area tier list. So, I'm just going to assume that this is like Joseon, in which case, yeah, average interest. Macedonia, A. The only reason it's not S tier is, other than Alexander's conquests, I don't really care. Alexander's conquests are always really interesting and fun to read about, but I'm not nearly as interested as like the whole like administration and the like. I mean, I guess there's the infighting of the Diadochi, but that's kind of after it fell apart. And if you want to include Macedon up through Roman conquest, then there are a few interesting things here and there. But honestly, it's an A tier off of Alexander, and that's really about it. And that's why it's not S tier. Yeah. What is next? Majapahit. It's not fair. I don't really know enough about it. I know that they unified a lot of Indonesia and they were an economic powerhouse. But I should read more before I'd give a serious judgment. Okay. Malacca, same thing. Mali, very neat. I mean, Mansa Musa alone is a fascinating character, but Mali's empire in West Africa is just kind of a very neat thing to read about. I also love the type of architecture that they had when like building like the Great Mosque of Jen. Like that was Mali, right? Or was it the Songhai? I hope it was Mali because I'm pretty sure. 13th century. Shoot, I don't remember if that's Songhai. Gosh. Here, let me... Okay, I'm not seeing Songhai, but if it's 13th century... Songhai... Okay, yeah, so yeah, it was during the Malian Empire. Okay, so... Like that, the whole point is that architecture I've always found kind of neat. Yeah. Mamluks. Average. Started with a slave uprising, which is kind of neat. They were also sort of a power. I find their very limited rivalry with the Ottomans kind of neat, but that's really kind of where it ends for me, honestly. Maratha, don't know enough about it. Indian history is my weak point. The Maurya Empire is the one area of Indian history where I know enough of Ashoka to where I can say that I find the Maurya Empire neat. Aside from Ashoka, who basically he started off as like a bit of a, he was eager to expand his empire, and then he when trying to conquer Kalinga, I think it was called, um, he was so horrified by the war he saw that he converted to Buddhism, and he made Buddhism the official religion of his empire, and so it was kind of this period where like Buddhism was the official religion of India, and it's kind of an interesting thing to read about, especially since Buddhism did get its start in India. People associate Buddhism with like more of like Eastern Asia, but it started in India. So it's kind of neat to read about that era of India. It's one of the few areas of Indian history where I can actually say like, oh, I actually kind of know a little about it. Maya, neat. Mayan aesthetic just is also awesome, similar to the Aztecs. So much about like the Mayan architecture, writing system, and culture is fascinating. The only reason that I put them in neat is because I know almost nothing about like their military history, because I know they had a lot of conflicts between each other. I know very little about that. I know that they had continued resistance against the Spanish and later the Mexicans for a long while, which is kind of neat. But I need to know more details about that. But I have not ever been bored by anything about Mayan history ever. So they definitely go in the neat category. Mexican Empire. I'm not sure if this is referring to the first one that lasted like 3 years or the other one that lasted like 5 years because it was ruled by an Austrian. In which case, kind of boring, not gonna lie. I like learning about the French invasion of Mexico, but in terms of like the empire itself, it's just not that interesting. Ming, I think the Ming are a little overrated. They got rid of the Yuan dynasty. They fell to the Qing dynasty right afterwards with the invasion of the Jurchen or the Manchurian people. I don't find anything else about the Ming dynasty interesting. I honestly don't. They, like, when I think of like the dynasties that unified China from within rather than from the outside, there's like basically like the three big ones are like the Han, like the Qin, or the four big ones are the Qin, the Han, the Tang, and the Ming. Those are like the four ones that people always think of as like the biggest and the most important and all that stuff. And honestly, like the Ming was like my least favorite of those four that I just mentioned. So yeah, I'm just gonna put them in overrated. Mongol Empire is obviously S tier. I mean, God, like Genghis Khan alone is enough to bring it to A tier. But Mongol administration is fascinating. I've also always been obsessed with the Mongolian writing script because the Mongols did not have a formal writing system until the empire, because Genghis was smart enough to realize that they were going to need something like that for administration, and so he commissioned some people to develop a writing system for the Mongols. And I'm gonna pull it up as an example, but it's a really cool writing script. It's like up to down cursive. It's kind of got like elements that are similar to like Arabic or Sanskrit in how like the letters are connected together, but it's got like the brush stroke characters that you see in a lot of like Eastern Asian writing systems, and it makes this really cool writing system. Like it looks gorgeous. But yeah, and I can actually write fluently in it because of how obsessed I was with it. I don't know any words, or I barely know anything about the Mongolian language, but like, you know, like I could write like anyone's name in the script because I basically just learned how to perfectly write in it in high school because of how obsessed I was with it. But basically, the fact that like they, you know, like Mongolian administration was fascinating. Mongolian warfare was fascinating. Um, the little competition between who gets to be the universal Khan, you know, the Khan, like it, that's always kind of neat. You know, as much of a flash in the pan as the Mongol Empire was compared to other empires, it you know, it's S tier for sure. Um, Morocco. Not gonna lie, I need to learn more about Moroccan history. Uh, the Mughals. Okay, so the Mughals are the other part of Indian history that I do sort of know about comparatively. Okay. Um, where would I put them? I'm gonna say average. Um, they didn't have that like unique story thing compared to like the Maria. Like they're like people like to talk about Barber and I forget the name of the other one, but there are two Mughal leaders that are considered very famous. Akbar, I think it was Akbar, wasn't it? It was like Babur and Akbar. That sounds right in my head. Um, but they didn't really interest me as much as like Ashoka did. And it's kind of neat in the sense of like, oh, it's a Muslim dynasty that controlled like 90% of India. They were also the ones that were there when the Brits kind of started taking over, but and of course the Taj Mahal, but like that, I don't know. Otherwise, it didn't really do as much for me. But they're not like boring. It's just like oh, yeah. Napoleonic Empire. I mean, let's be real here. It like wow, like from the French Revolution to 1815. Even if you don't count the French Revolution, say you start it specifically from when Napoleon took over. Like, wow, what a fascinating short little decade and a half of history. He, you know, aside from the fact that you've got like you've got basically like a world war going on. You've got your allies versus the one guy trying to take over all of Europe again, which is always an interesting dynamic. But you've got the unique battles where like where warfare is being revolutionized. The revolution continued into warfare. Administration was being changed. Like his civil code is still the basis of so many law systems in Europe, to where you know, just seeing about how all this happened in such a short amount of time is really fascinating. I mean, and you know, a quick rise, a quick fall. It's so short, but I mean, yeah, it's an S tier. Yeah. Oh, the North Sea Empire is separate. Okay. The North Sea Empire is like the one part of Danish history that I do actually find a little interesting, so I'm going to put them in average. So the North Sea Empire, there was a Danish king named Canute, and he managed to become king of Norway and England, and he conquered like a few parts of Sweden, not a lot, but point is he basically had the North Sea Empire, where he basically like was in charge of most of the major powers that bordered the North Sea. And he's kind of interesting, but that's really it. Oman, I need to know more. Ottomans. Ottomans, A tier. I I used to be very obsessed with Ottoman history. I loved reading books about Ottoman history. Suleiman has always been one of my favorite historical figures. Of course, the fall of Constantinople is always fun to read about. Um, the the few things that are keeping them from S tier is after Suleiman the Magnificent, and in between him and World War One, I don't find as interesting. Um, well, I guess like the Tanzimat reforms of the late 1800s are kind of interesting a little bit, but um, it's basically the rise of the Ottoman Empire to me is S tier, but the fall of the Ottoman Empire not so much. The fall of the Ottoman Empire is closer to like B tier. Um, and so I guess it just kind of averages out to A. It's still very fun to learn about. Parthia. Uh, See, okay, this is that. I'm gonna. I'm debating between average and overrated. Um, I'm gonna say average because I think people are already not nearly as interested in Parthia compared to other Persian dynasties anyway. So by definition, they're not overrated. They're honestly overlooked, but I kind of understand why. To me, they're not nearly as interesting as the Sassanids. Yeah, they fought a few wars with Rome. There are a few iconic moments, so they can be interesting, but they're just not nearly as interesting as other Persian dynasties. You know that yeah. Poland, Lithuania. I'm also gonna put that in average. They kind of like with Parthia, they have their moments where they're super interesting, but a lot of filler that I just like am not interested in. Um, but I'm never bored. It's just I don't know. I'm just never like as outside of memes. I'm not really as drawn to Polish history compared to other stuff. That's just me personally, though. Portugal. Portugal's boring. I'm sorry. Portugal kind of gives me a similar feeling to the Dutch in that they have all of this colonial and economic history that a lot of people seem to be interested in, but I just find boring. I honestly do. The whole, they had the spice trade war with the Ottomans. That doesn't really do anything for me. The Portuguese colonial empire, I mean, they had Brazil, it's kind of neat, but I don't know. It just nothing about it has really ever stood out to me as like super interesting. So I kind of find them boring. All right, Qing Dynasty. Qing Dynasty, I'm actually gonna put an A. If this was a tier list where I was rating how effective of an empire they would not be A tier. Because the Qing Dynasty dealt with so many problems, and they were not very stable, at least not towards the end, and boy, did they have a lot of unfortunate events in their history. But my God, are they not fascinating. The amount of interesting rebellions that happened during the Qing Dynasty is fascinating. The way that the Qing took over China from the Ming Dynasty is interesting because they got past the Great Wall because someone let them. They opened the door because they were going to hire them for help, and then they basically said, psych, you idiot, why would you open the door? And then they took over Beijing. And then it was like a 20-year process of them, like, province by province taking over China, which is kind of interesting. But, you know, so many rebellions that are fascinating to learn about. The Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, like, those are all endlessly fascinating to learn about. And then, of course, this is the era where Europe started intervening, so there's that kind of aspect to it, too. They were the first dynasty to face the brunt of Japanese outright invasion. I mean, the Ming dynasty kind of fought Japan whenever they invaded Korea, but, like, you know, this is when Japan is now actively invading China now. They were at such a crossroads in Chinese history that, as unfortunate as their dynasty was, this is a tier list about being fascinated, right? And just like with several other items on this list, like, what is more fascinating than something that's in constant chaos? Am I right? Just endlessly fascinating. And also, that is a badass flag. I mean, that's a really cool flag too. Rome. Yeah, it's S tier. The way that I would describe Rome is that, and someone in the chat actually just said this, but Rome is overrated but still S tier, and I would agree. They're almost like the Beatles of empires, in the sense of, are they a little overrated? How? There are people who are obsessed with Rome a little too much, but they are just so impactful and important and have so many neat things about them that it's like, how could they not be super popular? Like, even if you consider them overrated, they're still S tier. Like, Roman politics are fascinating, the rise of Rome is fascinating, the decline of Rome is fascinating, so many emperors that are neat to read about. Roman architecture is fascinating. Roman culture is interesting. Everything about Rome is interesting. There's not a single thing about Roman history that I find boring. There may be moments where I'm not in the mood, where I'd rather read about something else, but, like, I mean, everything about Rome is interesting. God, I just cannot even... I just cannot even imagine Rome being anything but S tier, if I'm being real here. Russia. Russian Empire. So, if this is an empire tier list, I'm gonna say that the Russian Empire is from Peter the Great onwards, because that's when it actually became an empire. In that case, overrated. I don't find Peter the Great that interesting. I guess even if we were to include before Peter the Great, I don't find Ivan the Terrible that interesting. I really don't. I find Catherine the Great sort of interesting, but that's really about it. Other than the Russian Revolution, I just don't really find anything interesting in Russian history, at least comparative to other stuff. So I think they're overrated. Like, if I'm being real here, yeah. The Safavid Empire. I'm going to. Oh, sorry, did not mean to pull up my Steam. I am going to say that the Safavids are average. Similar to, like, the Qing dynasty, they were what? No, wait, no, I'm thinking of the dynasty after the Safavids. Never mind. Safavids, neat. I was thinking of the, I can't remember its name now. It's the dynasty of Persia that was after the Safavids. But anyway, the Safavids are interesting in that they were the main rival to the Ottomans, and their little contests that they would have over Mesopotamia are definitely very neat to read about. And yeah, I'm not as obsessed with them as the Ottomans, which is why they're only in the neat category. But yeah, they're a very neat Persian dynasty to learn about. Sassanids, though, Sassanids are A tier. Sassanids are my favorite Persian dynasty, easily. Well, okay, never. Second favorite. I forgot about the Achaemenids, but after the Achaemenids, the Sassanids are my favorite. Wow, like the Sassanids are so fascinating from the fact that their whole shtick was let's make Persia great again. That's literally their whole shtick. They kind of remind me of stuff like Germany in World War II, in the sense of we need to revive the glory days and get revenge. They had the Sassanids, their whole history was trying to restore the Achaemenid Empire, and that drove them to where their wars with Rome were way more interesting than the Parthian ones, for sure. And the fact that there was a 25-year-long war with the Byzantines, where at one point they controlled Egypt, Mesopotamia, the middle, the Levant, Anatolia. They conquered they basically succeeded 80% of their goal of conquering the territories of the Achaemenids for a short while. And it culminated with a fascinating siege of Constantinople, where they teamed up with the Avars. That's some epic stuff. And the fact that this fighting would end up being the reason why that they would, or at least it would be a huge contribution to the rise of the Islamic empires, because they exhausted each other to death, that by the time the Islamic Empire came along, they just couldn't quite keep up. That is all endlessly fascinating to read about. Their aesthetic is also way cooler than the Parthians. The Sassanids are awesome. The Seleucids, average. The Diadochi are sort of interesting in summary. In detail, I don't find them as interesting. The Seleucids were always declining. Once the initial fighting had settled down, it was just, okay, we lost a little more land. We lost a little more land to the Parthians. We lost a little more land. Oh, we're still here. Okay, Rome, put us out of our misery. I don't find them as interesting. I wouldn't even say they're my favorite Diadochi. I would even say that I'd say that the Ptolemaic dynasty is more interesting than the Seleucids personally. But Seljuks, see, in many ways they're kind of like the progenitors to the Ottomans, but not nearly as interesting. I know they're a huge part of the First Crusade, but that's just not enough to really put anything past average interest, if I'm being honest. Serbian Empire. I need to read more about the Serbian Empire. I'm not as knowledgeable about medieval Serbian history in the same way that I would be with the Bulgarians. I definitely need to read more about it. What parts about Serbian history I do know, not the imperial part. It's later Serbian history. So I gotta be honest and just I don't know enough. Someone is crying in the comments, and I can't tell if it's because of Serbia or something else, but I'm sorry. I gotta be honest. Siamese empires, well, okay, no, I can't. There are some dynasties of Siam that I know nothing about, but uh, during like when they're trying to resist the colonial era, they're trying to resist encroachments from the British and the French. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, that's why I'm only going to put them in average, because there are several dynasties where I know very little about. The Sikh Empire, don't know enough about. Sonhei, I'm gonna put them in neat. The Sonhei basically succeeded the Mali Empire. They were a little more wild, shall we say, a bit more warlike compared to Mali. Um, their rise is very interesting. Their fall is really interesting too, because they basically fell apart because Morocco invaded them. Morocco basically trekked their army across the desert to just conquer them, and that is really interesting. I mean, I know I said I don't know enough about Morocco history, and overall I would say yes, but that is a detail I do know because of how I know about how the Sonhei fell apart, and that's really interesting. Um, I would say Mali's a little more interesting, but I would still overall put Songhai in the neat category. Um, Spain. Um, Overrated. I gotta put Spain in overrated if I'm being real. Yeah, they conquered most of the Americas. Whoop-de-doo. Disease did most of the work, and that's also just depressing. Their history as an empire, like don't get me wrong, the Reconquista is very interesting. So, like Iberian history is really interesting up to that point, but the actual empire, I just it's a mixture of depressing and overrated. It's just okay. Our disease wiped out 90% of the enemy, and now we're going to conquer what's left and then burn its history and then move on. I don't find, just kind of like with the British Empire, American colonial administration, I just don't find as interesting. And same with the Spanish. I it's just never really intrigued me that much. I know next to nothing about their adventures in the Philippines. I I don't know. Spain has just never been able to. It's never been able to grab me in the same way that other empires have. Srivijaya, I need to learn more about it. Swedish Empire, very neat. The Swedish Empire didn't last very long, but the it's just I don't know, something about like any Scandinavian country actually being like this bully great power, like able to go toe to toe with other major powers at the time, is it was already fascinating to me as a kid. Where it's like, wait, Sweden had an empire? Why would the Swedes have an empire? Then you read about it and it's really fascinating. How at one point, just like Sweden was just a major power. And their short stint as a major power is very fun to read about. Gustavus Adolphus is an interesting character. They actually had a colony in America, even if it didn't last very long. Yeah. I mean, of the Scandinavian countries, Sweden is probably the most interesting, in my opinion, to learn about. At least between the empires. So, I gotta put them in B. Tang Dynasty. A. I think that of the native Chinese dynasties, the Tang is the most interesting. Truly China at a zenith in terms of expansion and cultural reach. Like, the Tang dynasty controlled like most of Central Asia, where they were fighting battles with the Islamic dynasties. Like, for medieval history, that is insane outreach. geez, like, or how the Tang Dynasty broke up the Gurk Turks. Uh, they had several rebellions that were fascinating, like the An Lushan revolt. It is probably one of the most fascinating dynasties of Chinese history to read about. Like, it's just the most interesting parts of unified China. Divided China is also interesting, but that doesn't. But that this is an empire tier list. But Tang is very nice. Gotta love Tang, and the juice is delicious too. Let's see, what do we have left? Tibet. Neat. I definitely need to read more about Tibet, but what little I have read is fairly neat. The fact that Tibet at one point was just, building giant empires building a giant empire in the Himalayas, and how they were going toe to toe with China and India alike. I definitely need to read more, but definitely neat. Timurids. I think that Tamerlane is overrated. I mean, I don't. It's kind of weird because it's like I wouldn't say he's like. There aren't like too many people who are obsessed with him, but I don't know. I've just never found the Timurids nearly as interesting compared to other Persian dynasties. He almost broke the Ottomans. That was, I guess, kind of neat, but like everything else, I just don't really get much out of it. The Tui Tonga Empire. Average. It's in average interest because the fact that there was an economic empire in the Pacific Ocean during medieval times is fascinating. I would say I should read more about it, and I should, but there's also very little about it anyway. We know very little about it. But the concept of the empire alone is average interest, so that it deserves to go there. It's like I should pull up a map, because the Tui Tonga Empire was pretty large. So 950s to... It says 1865, but in reality, that was more like in practice. In terms of it being like a widespread empire, it was like closer to like ending in like the 1400s or so, but like oh look, it's my video. There's at one point where like they had a core area around here, but in terms of like economic influence, they controlled like huge swaths of Polynesia where they basically had economic dominance. Kind of similar to something like Athens, for example, but even if their core of their empire was still their home islands and parts of Fiji. But just I've always found like Polynesian history like very underrated anyway. I've just always been fascinated just by Polynesian history in general. But Umayyads, I'm gonna put in A. I find them more interesting than the Abbasids, because even though the Abbasids are more interesting in terms of administration, Umayyads are where you've got the peak of Islamic military expansion. This is where they're conquering Persia, they're conquering Byzantine lands in North Africa, they're conquering Spain, and the battles of like Pulcheres and stuff like that. Like that's the Umayyads, and like that's that's just it's always fun to read about. Vietnam. Putting all the Vietnam empires together is pretty. I don't like the B. I'm gonna say B. There are a few Vietnamese dynasties that I have found interesting. There are many Vietnamese empires that I know nothing about. So I'm just going to put it in B to kind of average it out. But like the history of like Vietnam, like preserving its independence from China over and over again, is fascinating. Yeah, I'm just gonna leave them in B tier. The Xiongnu. So I alluded to this earlier, but there is a hotly debated theory that the Huns are supposedly the Xiongnu that moved west. But for purposes of this, I'm going to say that they're not the same. The Xiongnu basically had a giant empire in modern day Mongolia, and they basically gosh, I put them in average interest, or I guess average, because they're not overrated. Because I don't know a lot of people who are like, oh, the Xiongnu, in the same way that they are with a lot of other things. But I don't think they're like super interesting. But just the fact that like they pose this giant threat to China, and they're the reason why that they had to build another Great Wall, or add on to it, I should say, because of how much the threat. And the Han had interesting campaigns where they had to take them down. So there are interesting things about it, but Yuan Dynasty. I'm gonna put neat. Not as interesting as some of the other dynasties of China, but it's the Mongol administration of China, the Forbidden City, Kublai Khan. I mean, I'm not gonna find that boring. I don't know why Ethiopia was last instead of in alphabetical order like the rest, but Ethiopia, I'm gonna also put in neat. Because like other than their struggle for independence against Italy, I don't really find anything else about the modern Ethiopian Empire super interesting. But both of their wars with Italy are just so interesting by themselves that it's enough to put them in B tier. So, yeah, obviously this tier list was missing a lot of empires. But at the same time, this is like 80 empires. This is a lot. So I'd say there was at least, we had empires from basically every continent, except for Antarctica. But for what it is, I think that there's a good variety here, even if there could have been more. Trying to think of like any major empires, like the Zulu aren't here. I'd probably put the Zulu in B tier. What's another empire that's missing here? I guess the Akkadian Empire, like the first empire, I could put that in like C tier. Let's see. The Avars I would have put in A tier, honestly. I think they're very fun to learn about. Here, let me look in the comments. Are there any other empires that you think this tier list really needed and that you want my opinion on? And then after that, we'll get into super chats. USA, if we count the American Empire as, well, you know what? It is. It basically is. I guess the question is about the American Empire. When does the American Empire start? Either way, it's going to be because I don't know. It's like the fascinating. This is where it's kind of weird, because it's like, as an American, when I think of like American Empire, I'm thinking of like, oh, you mean like when we took over the Philippines and Puerto Rico in 1898. But you could make an argument that it was an empire from the moment that we were, conquering land from Native Americans and Mexico and stuff like that, right? It I guess it depends on where it begins. Either way, I would say the USA, because it's about interest, what's fun to learn about. It would have to be A tier, just because American history is very fascinating. But that's assuming we're also including the stuff at home too, and not just America abroad. If it was just America abroad outside of North America, I would probably put it more into B tier, but otherwise, yeah. See any others? Kushan Empire. I need to read more about the Kushan Empire, so I can't really qualify that. Qin Dynasty. Okay, yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised that the Qin Dynasty wasn't there. Not to be confused with the Qing Dynasty. Qin Dynasty, I would put in A. It's the unification of China. It's very fun to learn about. Soviets. If we count the Soviets as an empire, I would put them in B tier. There are certain parts of the Soviet history I find a little boring, but I mean, like World War II, the Revolution, endlessly fascinating. Latin Empire. D. Actually, you know what? E. Latin Empire's boring, if I'm being honest. Let's see. Kievan Rus. I'd put Kievan Rus in overrated as well. I don't find it nearly as interesting. I'm throwing so much shade at Belgium. Yeah, you know what? Like, it is kind of interesting that Belgium ended up being the only one that I actively dislike learning about. And I actually kind of explained this earlier, but like in case you missed it, the only reason why Belgian Empire is in F tier is because the only thing of note of their colonial empire were their atrocities in the Congo. And it's super important, and I read a lot about it, but it just depresses me. I don't like learning about it. It's just depressing. And that's why it's there. And that's all it has. I can't say like, oh boy, I love learning about genocide in the Congo, right? Like, it's that's not really something I could ever say. All right, let's look into some super chats. Why am I not able to see the super chats? Cancel. Let me refresh. See if the super chats show up. Well, I apologize, but it says that someone sent super chats, but for whatever reason they are not showing up on my streaming tab. So I really apologize for that. I don't know why they're not showing up. I refreshed it and it says that there's no super chats, but clearly someone donated something. If you gave a super chat, just repeat what your question was in the comments and I'll try to answer it. But for whatever reason, they're just not showing up. Yeah, ask the super chat. Like I don't know, like just say that like your question was a super chat and then like I'll answer it. Yeah. I really appreciate you donating the money for the super chats though. I always appreciate that. So I definitely should answer your question. And also, there are a lot of comments that are like suggesting like, oh, where's this country? Not every country's an empire. So like someone said like the Visigoths, I wouldn't consider them an empire. They're just a kingdom, right? Not every entity that conquered something is an empire. So there are a lot of like, interesting places that aren't on this list because it's just empires, not nations. Okay. Do you have any non-empire / underdog countries / states that I am particularly interested in? Ooh, that's an interesting question. Underdog countries, non-empires. Oh gosh. I'd have to really think about that. Underdog countries. I guess I would need an example of like what you would consider an underdog country. There are definitely like countries that were never big empires that I found really interesting. Like I would say that about Czechoslovakia, I think is a good example. I find Czechoslovakian history very fascinating. For the short time it existed, I find Paraguayan history very fascinating. Yeah, I'd say Paraguay kind of counts as an underdog nation in many aspects, and their history is very fascinating. So that'll be my answer for that. A €2 super chat from Michael Fleshman. Thank you for the super chat. Smash or pass Song Dynasty? You know what? Smash. Learning about their campaigns against the against the Mongols is pretty neat. I'm not as familiar with like the pre-Mongol Song Dynasty, but still kind of neat. I hope I didn't miss any super chats that were sent before now. I'm not seeing anyone else saying that they had a super chat question. The ones that didn't show up. Although I just got a bunch of new ones. So thank you all for that. Majora Z, $10 super chat. Thank you very much. Non-Aztec Meso ones, the Purépecha Empire, Mixtec Empire, Teotihuacan, Monte Alban, etc. If I've read about them for the North America bit, I'd call those empires my area, my state. I'm gonna be honest. I know summaries about those because I'm researching them for North America. I have not gone super deep into any of them. I want to though. The Purépecha Empire, from what I have read about them, I do want to go more into it because they do seem very fascinating. But I haven't read enough. $20 from Etherwing. Thank you very much. Saying, just want to say keep up good work. Thank you very much. I always appreciate that. $2 from Varric Basilo. Nubian Empire is an underdog empire. You know what? Yes. If the Nubians were an empire on here, I would put them in A. I actually think Nubian history is very interesting. Someone said, what about Nazi Germany? If we count, I guess like that's technically an empire. I mean, simultaneously overrated, but still really interesting. Because it's World War II. What about World War II is not interesting, right? So I could see both overrated A and A, like at the same time. It just depends what aspect. But that's more of like the war itself than actual. But then again, like learning about like Nazi power structure is also kind of interesting because people have this idea that like, You know, Hitler was definitely an authoritarian dictator, don't get me wrong, but part of how he had control over Nazi Germany was he had multiple competing interests within the government that would basically be rivals amongst each other, and that was his way of preventing someone from becoming a rival to him. And that is really fascinating, that type of dynamic. So, I mean, yeah, I'd say Nazi Empire may not be fun, but it's definitely neat to learn about. What about the Galactic Empire? Well, the Star Wars Galactic Empire is always fun to learn about. Anyway, let's see, did I miss any? No, that's it. Would I consider the Commonwealth an empire? No, I wouldn't. It's a leftover husk of an empire. Rashidun Caliphate? I need to read more about it. I'm more familiar with Islamic history once the Umayyads came in. $2 from Varric Basilio. Thank you very much. America is an empire? Yeah, it basically is. And like I mentioned before, I'd put it in A. It's just always fun to read about. A lot of these suggestions, not gonna lie, these are suggestions that are already here. They may not stick out because not all of these have a flag, but like someone's like, oh, what about the Huns? Well, they're here. What about the Umayyads? Well, they're here. What about the Hittites? They're here. Like a lot of these suggestions I'm seeing in the chat are ones that are already here. Athenian Empire. That's a good question. Overrated. If Blue from Overly Sarcastic Productions is watching, I am so sorry because I already explained how I think that the Byzantines are sometimes overrated, but I actually think that a lot of ancient Greek history is fairly overrated too, but Athens especially. Sparta is interesting, but Athens I just don't find interesting. The Athenian Empire was basically like I'm trying to think of a good way to describe it. It's like it somehow has the Aztec system of bullying other city-states and stealing their money, and yet just none of the fascinating parts. I just don't find Athens interesting at all, so I put them in overrated. No, none of the Armenian empires were on here either. Admittedly, there are some Armenian empires that I know very little about, but like the Empire of Tigranes, I would put Tigranes' empire into A. That's a really fascinating empire to read about. I've thought about making a video on it too. Gran Colombia, I'm not sure I would consider Gran Colombia an empire per se, but you know, I wouldn't consider it an empire, even if it is sort of interesting to read about. And that's the thing, like, what is the fine line between like an actual empire versus just a normal but sort of powerful state, right? Ooh, the Iroquois. That's a good one. You know what? I would say that by the time the Iroquois are like conducting the Beaver Wars, they sort of are an empire, even if a very unique one. The Iroquois, I would put in A. The Iroquois are always fun to read about. All right. Wow, I've been streaming for 2.5 hours. I didn't see any other super chats. I'm sorry if you sent a super chat originally in the stream, and because like I said, YouTube kind of wiped the first few super chats I had, so I really apologize if I missed yours, but I just couldn't. They didn't show up. But someone sent them in. But anywho, these streams are fun. I think I'm gonna do more of these. I'm not sure what my next one will be, but you know, if I do another one, it'll probably be on a Saturday or a Sunday. So thank you all for coming in. I'm Emperor Tiger Star, and I'll see you guys next time.